Have you ever been pushed so far that you finally stood up, even though you knew the fight would cost you? That's exactly what happened to me when my homeowners association told me I couldn't keep the one thing that meant the world to me: my boat. And what I did in response? Well, it shocked the entire community, and it changed the balance of power forever. But to really understand why I made the choice I did, you need to know what that boat meant. Not just to me, but to my family. I grew up on the water. My father was a fisherman, not by profession but by passion. Every Saturday, before the sun even hinted at rising, he'd shake me awake with a thermos of hot HOA in one hand and his old weathered cap in the other. We'd spend the whole day on his small wooden boat, listening to the waves slap against the hull, while he taught me everything he knew about patience, about respect for the sea, and about finding peace in the middle of chaos. When he passed away, far too young, the only thing I wanted was to keep that tradition alive for my own kids. Years later, I finally had the chance. After saving for nearly a decade, I bought a modest boat. Not flashy, not extravagant, just a sturdy little vessel perfect for fishing trips, sunset rides, and quiet escapes. My wife and I named it Second Wind. It wasn't just a boat. It was a legacy. But the problem was, we lived in a neighborhood with an HOA. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sure, they had rules about lawn care and trash bins, and what kind of shutters you could install. But I figured as long as I respected the basics, I'd be left alone. I was wrong. The first letter arrived a week after I parked Second Wind on the small patch of my property near the water's edge. It was curt, almost cold. Remove unauthorized watercraft immediately. Non-compliance will result in fines. I stared at that letter for a long time. Unauthorized watercraft. My family owned the land, and the marina sat partially on my deed. I had every legal right to dock my boat there. Still, I tried to be polite. I went to the next HOA meeting with a smile and an explanation, paperwork in hand. I wish I could tell you they listened. Instead, I was met with stiff faces and folded arms. The president, a man named Richard, slicked back hair, expensive suit, the kind of guy who thrived on control, tapped his pen against the table and said, "Rules are rules. Boats are not permitted on visible property. This community is about uniformity. Uniformity." That word rang in my ears all night. My wife, Ellie, urged me to let it go. "It's not worth the stress," she said. But I could see the disappointment in my daughter Lily's eyes when she asked if we could still take the boat out that weekend. And I thought about my father, about how he would never have let anyone strip away something that brought so much joy, so much meaning. So, I ignored the letter. The fine started, 50 then 100, then 200. Every week, another envelope in the mailbox, another reminder that the HOA wasn't going to back down. Neighbors began whispering. Some shook their heads at me like I was the neighborhood troublemaker. Others, quietly, gave me nods of encouragement in passing. I wasn't the only one who thought the HOA had become too strict, too controlling. But I was the one standing in the crosshairs. Things escalated when Richard showed up at my door. He didn't knock politely. He pounded. When I opened, he stood there with 2 board members flanking him, as if this was some kind of military operation. "You're in violation of community code," he said flatly. "If that boat isn't gone by the end of the month, we'll pursue legal action." Something in me snapped. I wasn't rude, but I wasn't timid either. "Richard," I said, "that boat stays. My property, my marina, my family's memories. It's not negotiable." He smirked. The kind of smirk people wear when they think they've already won. "We'll see about that." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of Emily beside me. My mind raced. I knew I was fighting a machine, an HOA with lawyers and resources. But then another thought crept in. What if the power I had was greater than they realized? Because here's what Richard and the board had either forgotten or underestimated: the marina they all depended on, the docks where they tied up their kayaks and paddleboards, the launch they used for community events. All of it sat partly on land that legally belonged to me. For years, I had allowed free access without a second thought. But access was a privilege, not a right. The idea planted itself in my brain that night, and by morning, it had taken root. If they wanted to play hardball, I could too. I started quietly. I reviewed my property lines, pulled up the original survey documents, even walked the edges with a tape measure and a notebook. It was all there in black and white. The HOA had no ownership over my strip of waterfront. They used it because I allowed it, and suddenly, I realized I didn't have to allow it anymore. Before making my move, though, I confided in Emily. She was hesitant, worried about the backlash. But when she saw the determination in my eyes, she sighed, squeezed my hand, and said, "If you're going to do this, do it right. No half measures." So, I did. Within a week, I had hired a local contractor. Early one morning, before the sun rose, trucks arrived carrying lumber and fencing material. By noon, posts were going into the ground. By evening, a 6-foot fence stretched across the boundary line. Solid, unshakable, with a locked gate only I had the key to. When the HOA members came down for their usual evening stroll, they stopped dead in their tracks. Richard's face turned crimson as he realized what had happened. The Marina, the very heart of their weekend leisure, was now off limits. I leaned against second wind, arms crossed, and simply said, "You wanted me to move my boat. Fine. Now you can move your kayaks, your canoes, and your paddleboards somewhere else." The silence that followed was almost sweet. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a battle I never wanted, but one I was now fully committed to fight. The day after the fence went up, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People gathered at the waterfront like they were visiting the scene of some disaster, whispering in tight little circles. Some pointed at the fence with disbelief, others muttered about lawsuits, and a few, though they tried to hide it, smiled behind their hands as though they were secretly cheering me on. I knew what they were thinking. How could he do this? But just as many were quietly thinking, how did it take this long for someone to finally stand up to them? That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Of course, I wasn't invited, but word travels fast in a small community. By the next morning, I had 3 letters taped to my front door, all of them threatening fines, legal action, even community expulsion. I laughed at the last one. Expel me from land I owned outright. That wasn't just arrogance. That was desperation. Still, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. Lawsuits cost money, and HOAs often win simply by wearing you down. But fear has a way of sharpening resolve. And when I saw my daughter sitting on second wind, swinging her legs off the side, and whispering, "Don't let them take this from us, Dad," I knew I couldn't back down. The turning point, a few days later, the inevitable happened. Richard showed up again. This time he wasn't smirking. He was red-faced, veins bulging, clutching a folder so tightly his knuckles were white. "This is outrageous," he bellowed the moment I opened the door. "You are obstructing community access." "That marina is for everyone." I stayed calm, maybe calmer than I expected. "Richard, the marina you're talking about sits on my land, my deed, my property lines. The only reason anyone's had access all these years is because I allowed it. You wanted to take away my rights, so I took away yours. That's fair." He waved the folder in my face. "We'll see what a judge thinks of this." And then, something happened that I'll never forget. From across the street, one of my neighbors, a quiet man named George, a retired Navy veteran, walked over. He'd been listening the whole time. Without saying a word, he stood beside me. A few seconds later, another neighbor joined. And another. Within minutes, half a dozen of us stood shoulder to shoulder. George finally spoke. "He's right, Richard. You've been pushing everyone around for years. Maybe it's time somebody pushed back." Richard sputtered, but he knew the tide was turning. With an audience of his own constituents watching, He couldn't bluster his way out. He stormed off, slamming his car door so hard it echoed down the street. That was the moment I realized something important. This fight wasn't just mine anymore. The battle in the open. The HOA tried to play dirty after that. They plastered notices accusing me of endangering community safety. They spread rumors that I was planning to sell my land to a developer who would build condos. They even sent a lawyer's letter threatening to sue for loss of recreational amenities. But here's the thing about standing up, Sime. Once you take the first step, others start finding their courage too. Neighbors who had been silent for years began knocking on my door, offering to testify, to show old maps of the property lines, even to pitch in for legal fees. People told me stories of being fined for having the wrong shade of mulch, or for leaving their trash can out an hour too long, or for painting their shutters a color one shade darker than approved. Everyone had their own scar from dealing with the HOA. I wasn't just fighting for my boat anymore. I was fighting for all of us. And then something incredible happened. At the next HOA election, an event usually ignored by most residents, the turnout was massive. People who hadn't set foot in a meeting for years showed up, ballots in hand. And when the votes were counted, Richard was no longer president. In fact, most of the board was replaced. The new leadership wasn't perfect, but they were human. They listened. They acknowledged that the HOA had become more about control than community, and most importantly, they withdrew the lawsuit threats and opened a conversation about compromise. The resolution, in the end, here's what we agreed on: the boat, Second Wind, would stay exactly where it was. The fence would remain, but with a locked gate that I controlled. I could decide when and if to grant access. The HOA would revise its rules, focusing on genuine community needs instead of petty control. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every neighbor who had ever felt powerless under the weight of bureaucracy. But perhaps the most powerful moment came a week later. I was out on the dock, tightening a rope on Second Wind, when George walked up. He handed me a folded American flag, the same one that had been given to him when he retired from the Navy. "I want you to have this," he said quietly. "Not because of the fight, but because you reminded us all what it means to stand up for something worth protecting." I tried to protest, but he pressed it into my hands. And for the first time in this whole saga, I felt tears sting my eyes. The lasting lesson today: the Marina looks different. The fence is still there, a reminder of the line I drew. But the atmosphere has changed. People laugh more. Kids play without parents glaring over their shoulders about HOA approved behavior. The board still exists, but now it works with the residents instead of against them. And every Saturday morning, just as my father once did, I take Lily out on Second Wind. We drift across the water, rods in hand, the air fresh and open. Sometimes Emily comes too, sometimes it's just the two of us. Either way, I know we're building something stronger than rules, stronger than fences. We're building memories. So what's the lesson in all this? It's simple. Don't let anyone bully you out of what matters. Rules have their place, yes. Communities need structure. But when structure turns into chains, it's time to break them. My boat was more than fiberglass and wood. It was freedom. It was legacy. It was love. And in defending it, I discovered that courage has a ripple effect. When you stand tall, others will too. And that's how a single boat and a single fence ended up changing an entire community. Final note for your video ending, he narrator voicey. If you've ever been told you don't have the right to protect what matters, remember this story. Sometimes the smallest stand can spark the biggest change, and sometimes one boat can anchor a whole neighborhood in courage.